Hi, I'm Chris Lotz with Lotz Real Estate Group. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Beyond the Keys, a Lotz podcast. Please like, comment, and subscribe to all of our new content. And again, welcome. Sitting down again with Lotz. How are you doing today?
Great day.
What do you got cooking this week, today?
Well, great week. A couple new listings coming up, market analysis appointments. Things are going great. A couple of things under contract.
What's today? July
14th.
July 14th.
Yeah.
So Q1, Q2 is over. We're in the beginning of Q3.
Yes.
Good year so far?
Great year so far. We have been blessed, lucky, working hard to get buyers and sellers home sold and bought. So yeah, heading into July, still a nice pace. June historically was a little quiet, but getting back up in July, we're seeing a lot of phone calls.
I had a young, we'll work with a lot of clients, but that young first-time home buyer client that is looking at downtown Brighton.
Yeah.
They said the exact same thing last night. It's like, where are all the listings? June, historically, very, very slow.
Yeah.
Month or year to year, for a lot of reasons.
Yep.
School, vacations.
Graduation, vacation. So historically, I've always felt this in June.
Yeah.
And then I always encourage sellers to, hey, let's have a goal after the 4th of July, mid-July, to get your house ready and up then.
That's what I was going to say, is kind of like after the 4th of July, we start to see a little bit more inventory, which we have. Like over the past 15 days or so, there's been a lot of things on the market.
Yeah.
And even like last night, the mom, she asked me, are we still having a supply issue? And we did kind of decompress that a little bit, because there is a supply issue only because there's a demand issue. So it's not just a supply issue or a demand issue, it's a supply and demand issue. And people are still putting multiple offers on homes in certain price points.
Well, that's it. First-time home buyers, we're still at a shortage. I mean, just a shortage of that inventory.
Yeah, and she was, this same mother was very strongly concerned that we were heading in a direction, which we are technically in a recession, 2 quarters back to back with negative GDP, but she was convinced, and a lot of people are convinced, that we're headed towards the 2008.
Oh gosh no. And that'll be a whole nother podcast that we'll be working on. But no, we're not at 2008. We have the whole dynamics and complexity of 2008 are nothing what they are compared here.
Do you feel like right now our homes continue to appreciate? You're not pushing the limit, but are things still selling for top dollar? Do you see corrections in prices? Do you see something that could have sold today for $350 would have sold for $400? And buzz aside, do you see that depreciation or the the cutting costs? Do you see the housing valuation starting to not plummet but turn?
I think it's just correcting itself is really what it is. I don't see any major depreciation. I think that we've been on that acceleration appreciation rise, and what's happened, the pulse of the market is like, oop, we slowed down. Interest rates are up there. Inflation has caused us to readjust things. People's buying power is adjusted. So I just think it's just a correction. I think recession defines it as sort of a little bit of a setback. I mean, so you take that word and put it into your own interpretation. But I think correction is what I would like to say.
Yeah. And a lot of people say for the past 2 years, it was kind of like a fake market. So 2019, the last realistic market outside of COVID,
right,
was kind of like that. And we just did a video on it recently. Was the last, statement for a healthy market and continue to appreciate 2020, 21, and then early 2022, kind of like not that fake market, but a lot of fake market buzz, supply and demand, causing things to be a little crazier. So we're getting a little more to like the realistic, still a seller's market.
Absolutely.
But we've kind of gotten closer to that middle market to a seller and a buyer's thing, but still a seller's market, price right and price accordingly. You can't push what you could have pushed 6 months ago or a year ago.
It's a different market. You've got to look at things in different light because we aren't what we were 6 months ago. So that's why pricing is really critical. People are thinking, okay, we're gonna go for the moon here, and no, we cannot go for the moon. We've got to be really conscientious of what that pricing is so that we don't overshoot it and shoot ourselves in the foot later.
Yeah. And we've been talking about it for a few minutes now, but today we're kind of talking about, are we in a housing bubble or a start of a crash? And one thing to point out, and actually I don't even know if I want to bring it up because I don't know the true definition of a recession, because you did say recession, but we're kind of talking about bubble or a crash. Recession, a period of temporary economic decline during which trade and industrial activity are reduced, generally identified by a fall in GDP in two successive quarters. And is there necessarily a direct correlation? Not necessarily, because historically, the most recent recession, we did have a decrease in property values and valuations.
Yes.
But there was recessions in the 20s, 40s, 60s, the 80s. When was Bill Clinton president? 90 something?
Yeah.
90s, we had recessions. There wasn't major decrease in property values. So a recession isn't necessarily a direct correlation to property values. It can have an impact,
Right.
and it can impact certain industries. But historically, outside of 2008, the recessions that you've seen, they're not always a direct correlation.
That's
am I
correct.
wrong?
That's correct. Yeah, it's not always impacts the housing market in a.
It could,
It could,
but
absolutely.
historically, over the past 100 years in America, it is not always.
That's correct.
But our recent history, obviously, people have a little bit of PTSD to that.
Yeah.
To kind of think about, what if, worst case scenario. So it's good to keep them fresh in your mind so we don't repeat ourselves. But just because we're in a recession does not mean we have a crash or a bubble hitting currently, or
Absolutely.
what 2008 is going to happen.
Well, and I'm thinking, stop talking to the media. You know what I mean? We're blossoming here, and we're still doing great in our county. So,
And that's probably like more or less the point of this conversation is constantly people are asking us, where are we at? What are we doing? What's going to happen? When's that correction coming? Or when's when are things going to decline in price? We're in Livingston County. We're thriving. We have pretty stable property values even through 2008 to 2015. We did see a decrease in those, but for the most part, not a lot of foreclosures historically on the historical average nationwide. So it's more or less just a conversation for people to realize, how these three things are defined, not just to follow, big media and the scare tactics, and that's one thing we will talk about. So, the first point of the first definition is, what is a crash? A market crash is a sudden dramatic decline of stock prices across a major cross-section of a market, resulting in a significant loss of paper wealth. Crashes are driven by panic selling and underlying economic factors. They often follow speculation and economic bubbles. Do you anticipate a crash? Yes or no? So, the stock market is down. Yeah. So, but two, a recession or a crash doesn't always affect every single market. And I think that's what people need to realize is just because stocks are down does not mean houses are going to follow. Do we have the crystal ball to know that future?
No.
Not at all. But at this point in time, we are seeing things stabilize, shift, but still be a very much so a seller's market for certain price points and for certain products.
correct. So,
Anything to say on that?
no.
Did
that's a
they
good thing.
define 2008 was a crash, recession. Was that also defined as a bubble? What is a bubble? An economic bubble is a situation in which asset prices are much higher than the underlying fundamentals can reasonably justify. So people would probably argue we're more in a bubble, but things are still appraising, knock on wood. Bubbles are sometimes caused by unlikely and overly optimistic projections about the future. They could also be described as prices which strongly exceed the asset's intrinsic value. Well, let's talk about what drives a market bubble. Let's just talk about, I guess, what these how the market is from 2008 to 2020.
The 2008 was a crash.
Okay.
Okay, it was a crash because what happened is the economy and depreciation, just the housing market crashed because of loss of jobs, and people were overextended.
Yeah. And this talks about how 2008 was had stayed. Well, qualifications is a big thing for the housing market. So the recession hit, and then we had a crash. But I think the reason that crash happened, to your point, is because of a lot of contributing factors.
Yeah.
Unemployment, but then too the direct correlation to like how the mortgage industry has impacted that.
Yes.
So back then, I wouldn't know, you would know, predatory lending. They took advantage of a lot of people that weren't qualified.
Absolutely. I mean, if you had a pulse, you got a loan.
Yeah.
So everything was distorted then. They were getting 120% loans on houses. It was all based on, both individuals' income, that kind of thing.
And that's like to go
Nobody
back.
had any equity in their home.
Boom. And to go back to the bubble definition, we might be surprised at what things are selling for, but one, things are still selling for those prices. So I believe by definition, it's not strongly exceeding the asset's intrinsic value. Somebody is putting that value onto it, and the bank is justifying that as value, but it's not a 2008. One, those appraisals were kicked down the road. Buddies were doing them. There was no regulation, no value, no regulation or no rules. Well, I'm sure there were rules, but were they governed is probably the bigger question. And then today, again, we had another video talking about it. Millennials right now are young first-time home buyers.
Yeah.
They're more qualified more than ever.
Yeah.
They still have debt, but they're still hitting these qualifications, 50% debt to income. Back then, you could have stated income loans.
Oh golly, I know I had one of those.
So
But
what'd
I
you
was
tell me you
honest.
made? How many people were honest?
I don't know, but I was honest, and I know how much I can afford.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were way overextending that, and again, it goes back on the consumer. We all know how much we can afford in a month.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Well, and two, how many times today do we see first-time home buyers or young buyers saying, "I'm qualified for $500,000, but I want to spend $350,000."
Yeah,
Good for you.
absolutely.
But it's probably the opposite back then.
Yeah.
I'm qualified for $350,000. I want to buy that $500,000. And there was cheap debt. Granted, it's probably the same debt that we have right now, 6.5, 6%. Talked to our lender recently, and right now, 2008 kind of had very similar plus or minus, but historically it was cheap debt. So cheap debt, predatory lending practices, low regulations for the whole aspect of the lending process, and then a complex financial engineering where people were confused. Now people need to be disclosed things, understand things, qualified for things, overly qualified for things.
Oh yeah, it's quite a process underwriting. So
And in 2008, that's where that bubble definition comes into play. That was uncharted territories. We're kind of back to those territories. So, plus or minus, it's still uncharted. The point being is more people have more equity in their homes than they've ever had.
absolutely.
You were saying 120% loan to values.
Yeah.
That existed?
Well, I might have exaggerated a little bit, but yeah, they were getting 100% financing.
Yeah.
For
Or they got a loan and then they had home equity lines of credits over that
Exactly,
evaluation.
exactly.
They
That
were
was it.
by definition underwater.
yeah.
So, and again, last night when I was talking to these parents and these young first-time home buyers, one, the last time they bought a house was in 1994. So a lot of things have changed.
Yeah.
But the first thing I said was, how many people do you know that were actually underwater day one of mortgage? So day one of mortgage underwater is that's scary. And again, now people are pushing themselves to make sure that they have 15 to 20% down, not required, but people want to know that they're qualified for things. And two, qualified for one person's income. And if it's dual income property, obviously you're far more qualified. So
Well, and I think that a lot of the younger folks saw their parents go through the recession, so they don't want to duplicate that.
Yeah. And if it does duplicate, and that's how we kind of ended, I said, if it does duplicate, then you know what? Our generation needs to rise up, slap the hands of the people who continue to make this mess, and take control of our own futures. Because at the end of the day, we're 20 to 35 years old. We got a long time on this earth. And again, if we're making the same mistake 10 years later, shame on us as humans. And again, back to the definition of the bubble with the overvaluation and the speculation, I don't believe that is the same contributing factor to right now. You're like, what's driving this demand in 2020 and 2022? COVID had a big impact on that. People going hybrid, people leaving communities, getting to different communities. So leaving the major metropolitan areas, working hybrid, working remote, and raising the evaluations or property values of more or less rural communities. So 2020 to 2022, and correct me if I'm wrong, or you tell us, 2005 to 2008, it was a seller's market, or was it a buyer's market, or was it a stabilized even market?
2005, I think it was more of a normal market.
Okay, so not a seller's, not a buyer's.
No, I don't think so.
There wasn't an influx in two. We also,
it was the early 2000s was a bit crazy. It was a seller's market. There was a shortage of inventory.
Yeah, the most recent video we did have recently was talking about building, overbuilding, underbuilding, and in those early 2000s, we were building the homes that we needed to keep up with our population.
Correct.
2008 to 2016, we had that decrease in underbuilding, and therefore, that's probably a huge contributing factor to the demand. Now young people are post-college, young professionals, no longer wanting to be rentals, interest rates are down. Let's get some equity, let's get some, hard assets and be able to kind of appreciate with that market. So again, inherently, the drive of that appreciation is back to the whole point, supply and demand, not necessarily by the definition of a crash or a bubble, at least how we're kind of seeing these things of what these professionals are saying.
Yeah.
So, what is keeping our market healthy? The points that I have, and let's just talk about the points. In 2022, you have to be actually qualified, which we just talked about, for a mortgage and make money. So it's very hard to get qualified. And again, we've been talking about it for the past few minutes. In 2008, you didn't have the same regulations or the process to get a mortgage. What was that process in 2008?
I told you, if you had a pulse, you got a loan.
You got a pulse, you got a loan.
Yeah, I mean, that was really about it. It was pretty crazy.
It's crazy to think about that you could literally just have stated income.
Yeah.
No tax returns, no
Nothing.
W-2s, no pay stubs, stated income. I make $100,000, lend me money.
I know, doesn't that sound crazy?
Yeah. It kind of doesn't sound real. So, lower supply, higher demand. Same thing we've been talking about. A lot of this drive is not over speculation, but the tangible connection to supply and demand and how we're seeing that appreciation. People don't want to call them biddy wars or, but ultimately people are,
Driving
bidding
those
prices up, driving
up the prices up.
And we're still seeing that.
Oh, absolutely.
In certain products.
Yeah.
I think the problem right now is, what's the problem right now? From 3% to 6%, how is that affecting certain buyers?
The lack of buying power. So what they could buy 6 months ago, they can no longer buy because of the increase in interest rates. So if you were at 400, 6 months ago, you're at 350.
Yeah.
And
I don't know if I'm going to bring that up here. It is a point. A year and a half ago, people that were saying they'll buy when the market crashes are now dealing with 6.5% interest rates, and home prices have marginally reduced, or marginally reduced in their mind, but now their buying power is gone. We're gonna wait for 6 months and we're qualified for 325, and now what's worth 325, you're only qualified for 275, and now we're looking at 250 products that might go for 275 that are inferior.
that's a little frustrating.
Yeah. So we don't know what the future is gonna hold, but at the end of the day, the people that talked about waiting for these opportunities, one, it still hasn't come, but now we have the highest interest rate that we've seen in a decade.
Right.
So are you better or worse?
Well, it's
I think it's pick your poison. And for me, I don't know. Granted, I'm still buying things at 7% interest rate.
Yeah.
The numbers don't make sense though.
You're not going to be, locked into that forever.
Yeah.
There's things you can do to, correct that and work with that.
Lender said recently is marry the house, date the interest rate.
Right.
And two, if you look up 3 sources, 10 sources, 5 are going to say crash, 5 are going to say, we're going to see this appreciation, wait for interest rates to come back down. And 2, the inflation reports just came out at 9.1%. And our lender did say that if it was over a certain threshold, that might have a positive impact to lower interest rates.
Right.
I believe if it was over 8.5, it might have an impact to reduce those interest rates. If it was below, we would probably or might be vice versa, because it came in at 9.1. We'll have to see what that hits again to combat that. But the biggest impact of a recession, recessions are trying to drive prices back down for all industries, gas, housing, construction, even housing prices. So not necessarily a bad thing, but the direct correlation is to the crash of the bubble. But that's to be determined. So what is our market currently doing, in your opinion? Shifting, cooling?
Like I said, I'd like to always figure out, we're sort of still in the midst of the transition, the pulse of the market, coming out of June, which is historically quiet. I think what we should see is still some balancing, correcting, but I still think that there's buyers out there.
A lot of buyers out there.
The inventory is increasing. So buyers have, the great thing is it's still a seller's market. Sellers just have to price accordingly. Buyers have more options. So that is the positive.
One thing I want to point out on that is I think buyers are becoming more specific. I don't want to say picky, because you can be picky with certain purchases, but they're becoming more specific.
Well, they have more options now, so they can be.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then even too, more people actually think, we have inventory. Zillow says it, MLS says it. A lot of these metric systems prove that year over year we're hitting records for listings sold. So again, not just a supply issue or a demand issue, but a supply and demand issue. I heard recently, and I'm just kind of curious in your thoughts, is a lot of people bought homes because they needed a home, they needed a place to live, but they compromised on what they were looking for. And there might be an opportunity here in the next few years for people, again, buyers, to get things more closer to fair market value. Sellers are not losing money, but fair market value for them to actually buy the properties they want, marry the home, date the interest rate.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that? Do you think a lot of people have bought homes just to buy homes, to be in a home because they needed a home? I mean, you need housing, but do you think that they sacrifice and then there might be a influx in listings in the next 2 to 3 years?
Well, it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense that people did compromise, and depending on where their value stays, if they can cash out of it and go to the next house without a loss, I'm sure we could see more of that. But I am seeing that people did settle because their options were limited.
Yeah. And time will tell. We don't know about that. And then too, I think the biggest driving factor on that is interest rates. So in the next 2 to 3 years, will interest rates come back down that fast? Who knows? Everything that goes up will come down. It's a timing thing. Will we see 3s and 4s again? For sure. But when? And then that's, I think too, at certain price points, more or less it's a number on a piece of paper. It's not going to hold them back from not buying a house or not selling a house. And I think the silver lining to all this stuff is whatever. At the end of the day, if you need to sell your house, sell your house. If you need to buy a home, you need to buy a home.
Right.
The interest rates, the monthly payments, those are good. Those are definitely factors, not the consideration. But you need to do what you need to do for your family, and timing's everything. But if you don't time things perfectly, it doesn't really matter, in my opinion. I think you just need to, and the question being is, when should I buy my house? When should I sell a house? When it's right for you.
Yeah. Bottom line.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on, you know, kind of a compare and contrast from 2008 today? Do you feel like, at least just not speculatory, you know, we're not economists, but at the end of the day, does this feel like 2006 to 2007?
Not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. So I think doing an update on this and revisiting in a couple months will be.
We might be in our words, or we might be saying like, hey.
No, I'd like to. I mean, we're in the midst of it right now. So you know, it's hard to say, but that's another topic in a couple months.
Cool. Thanks for tuning in. Chris Lotz with the Pat Lotz Real Estate Group. Thanks again for being here today for another episode of Beyond the Keys. Live local, buy local, use local, and as always, there's lots to love in Livingston County.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to use those like, comment, and share buttons below. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at Pat Lotz Real Estate for more helpful home buying and selling tips. Want a free comparable market analysis? Scan that QR code on your screen or visit our website at www.patlotz.com and fill out the request form. There's lots to love in Livingston County.